Welcome PSY 364 students. Our Psychology of Men and Boys course has reached week number 5. This is my commentary for this week, and there are some complex matters that we need to acknowledge, and hence I'm going to produce 2 videos. This video has to do with the inner experience of men and boys. And in order to address that and put Kilmartin and Smiley text into context, we need also to understand something about phenomenology and its place in psychology. So I'll try and cover that briefly and as helpfully as possible. And then in the second video, I would like to speak to the issue of the developmental aspects of understanding the inner experience of men and boys. So this week, week 5, is the final week of the first module of our course. Next week, in a related topic or theme, we'll look at the emotional experience of men and boys. But to really appreciate the richness of this area, we need to deal with this question of inner experience. Let me first of all say that often in psychology and in the public's understanding of psychology, which I refer to as pop psychology, often inner experience is seen as less than from the point of view of the science of psychology. In other words, subjective experience is somehow seen as data of less value than so-called objective data, counting behaviors and the like. This is very important as we look at the inner experience of anybody, or any sentient being for that matter. So let me take a position here that I think is pretty mainstream and yet reveals some differences in my perspective from Smiley and Kilmartin that might be helpful to you to consider. I believe, and I think I can make the case for the fact that subjectivity is useful data either for persons in their lives or for researchers developing a knowledge of the psychology of men and boys that is more generalizable and hence ought not to be dismissed because it's, quote, merely subjective. So that's point number 1, and that's very important. Again, as a clinical psychologist, as well as a researcher, I know of the difficulty in bridging the values of objectivity with those of affirming the subjective experience of people as a necessary requirement to promoting growth and indeed healing of, again, all people, and for that matter, sentient beings. So all that's pretty grandiose and pretty high level. And now let me come down to what I hope students in this course take away from this brief engagement with the inner experience of men and boys. As you can see from our humorous image on our website this week, often the minds of men and boys become objects of comical critique. And we can see this, and we saw it in our earlier look at Zimbardo's work and that of others asking about is there indeed a boy crisis or a male crisis, and hence should we study the psychology of men and boys from the point of view of men and boys in trouble. I don't believe this is sufficient. I believe it's a useful perspective, but I think it's important that as we look at the topic of the psychology of men and boys, we not fall into that problem framework or indeed that rather dismissive comic framework that is exemplified by our image on the website this week. So what's our alternative becomes the next question. And I think a deeper study of humanistic psychology and phenomenological methods, qualitative research, will allow us to understand the place of subjectivity in the science of psychology, and more specifically in the science of the psychology of men and boys. Addressing these issues and these biases in the community, in our lives, is another matter, which we can also deal with. So, that being said, the takeaways for students in this course, number one, is to understand the dilemma of studying inner experience in the traditions of science that value objectivity. In other words, to come to grips with the issue of subjectivity as a source of valid and valued scientific data. Point number two, in order to do this, students have to have a clear understanding of what phenomenology is and is not. It is not the same as psychology, and I'll comment on that in a moment. And also to see how phenomenological psychology fits into the tradition of humanistic psychology, which students were introduced to in their Psych 100 courses. So I know this is of limited value to those who are less invested in psychology, and I will be as concise as I can be, and I'll limit myself in this video to nothing more than 12 minutes. So let's take phenomenology first. Phenomenology predates psychology. It is in fact a distinguished tradition within the field of philosophy. And to that end, and I will show you in this week's folder, in the weekly folder, last one in Module 1, if we go to week 5, I've put in some supplemental materials, including this video, and as you probably noticed as you were opening this video, the link right below this one is an introduction to phenomenology. Phenomenology here is from the Encyclopedia of Philosophy at Stanford, and I like it because it's concise. And I would ask you to simply look at what is phenomenology and how is that different than phenomenological psychology. Because remember, this is in the field of philosophy. So that would be supplemental number 1, and hopefully that will tell you that philosophers for centuries have grappled with this question of existence and proof of existence and the issues of the inner life as it relates to logic, which is a tenet of many, many schools in philosophy. So knowing something first about phenomenology as a field in philosophy is important. Secondly, if you follow the link right beneath that, you will see a Wikipedia introduction to phenomenology within psychology. Now, I recommend that unless you have a special interest in this, you do not spend a lot of time on this, simply because it's difficult. And it's a very specialized world that is foundational if you're interested in qualitative research or in mixed methods research within any of the social sciences. But that being said, it is dense and merits certainly a course itself, perhaps later in your academic career or in graduate school. But visit this Wikipedia, read the 2-3 paragraphs briefly, and post questions on the discussion board, and I think we're good. The goal here is to understand what phenomenology is and how it differs from phenomenological psychology, which is really the development of knowledge through a shared set of research assumptions and practices. So That should take you, lead you to understand phenomenology in these two disciplines of philosophy and psychology. I think that's pretty good. Now, linking that to Smiley and Kilmartin, which is to say chapter, let me pull this up, we're looking at chapter 7 this week, and you will be introduced to humanistic psychology, which I mentioned a moment ago, and we will look at the role of subjectivity in contrast to the more objective learning theoretical approaches. You will also be introduced to the idea of existential psychology, and I will simply say to you that existential psychology is very parallel to phenomenological psychology. We could almost see it as a subfield, depending on how you want to develop boxes for all of these things. But existential and phenomenological psychology are both distinct in that they focus upon the inner experience of people, both in a research context and in the context of clinical psychology. So I'm 30 seconds away from my 12-minute max now, so I'm not going to go on further in this video, except to say, look at the summary in Chapter 7, compare it to these supplementals that will give you a deeper understanding of context, and then think about it in terms of your course project. And I do hope that you will include the inner experience of men and boys as part of your data gathering for that project. So more on that later. Okay, I'm at my 12-minute max, so I'm going to stop this video now.